Undead armies. Mindless minions willing to do everything if you give the command. Essentially fanboys. So first and foremost, an undead army seems almost to be too perfect to be true. They don't need sleep, food or drink. And they never tire, complain, flee or demand payment. So let's break all of those many advantages down. If your army is able to march without any stops or rest required, they can outmaneuver pretty much any army centered around foot soldiers. Because normal soldiers require an immense logistical apparatus. In order to keep them in fighting condition, they need food, water, basic protections from the elements, some basic means of hygiene and medicine. Even if it is just quarantine or something like that. And if the food rots or the Lord's water supply is poisoned by his enemies, then the number and the combat effectiveness of their loyal subjects will fall pretty quickly. Furthermore, they require cloth, especially footwear, to march at a somewhat reasonable speed. For example, Napoleon managed to surprise most of his enemies because he was able to move his army very fast to key locations in order to intercept and annihilate his foes. And while he is mocked for wandering into Russia unprepared, he usually didn't need that much of provision, since he managed to teach his army to live off the land to some extent. And while he generally was able to achieve higher speed on a strategic level due to proper footwear, higher morale and better logistics, an undead army doesn't need any of this. They can carry more useful materials like ammunition or wood for battering rams, or simply none of it to move incredible fast. And if an army can't tire, there's no need to rest. You can march from dusk till dawn, and given proper guidance, even during the night. So essentially 24/7. And if you are commanding an undead host but are one of the living, just have these skeletons carry you.
Carry me.
The next big advantage is the unbreakable, unyielding nature of the undead warrior. They do not fear and will not flee unless ordered to do so, and thusly they can't be routed. They will fight to their death. You know what I want to say, right? And this is very important because almost no battle is fought to the last man. If one side flees, it's essentially over. But not only does an undead know no fear, they inflict it. Facing off against undead hordes, shouting and screaming and hurling themselves at you without any regards for their own unlife is a bone-chilling experience. Knowing you're in the first line and that 100 skeletons will try to kill you would have quite the impact on morale. Because after 10 skeletons or so, even the last idiot would start to realize that the other 90 bone boys won't run away. And you will start to feel very tired at this point. So imagine a scenario where morale doesn't play a role for one side, because Undead Army, they can simply grind the enemy down. And minute by minute, the task would be easier, since they don't tire, and even if they are defeated, they would have taken a huge chunk out of the enemy army. So if a larger and equally competent army is simply not willing to accept horrendous losses over 50, 60, 70, 80 or even 90% to achieve victory, even an inferior undead force will prevail, simply because the sacrifices required to beat them are far too great. Speaking of sacrifices, every soldier needs to be born, raised, trained, fed, equipped, and kept in fighting condition. If you want to replenish half your army, you might have to wait an entire generation, which also means that Westeros, having just survived the War of the Five Kings and currently fighting the War of the Five Queens, is in a truly bad position to face off against the Night King. And even if your country has an ample supply of suitable recruits, it will cost your nation a lot, because every soldier is taken out of the normal economy, where he in general would have been able to generate a net gain, and is put into an army where he generates a net loss during peace times. And in a medieval army, especially in low fantasy settings like Game of Thrones, many soldiers won't be killed by the undead. They would die because they succumb to some sort of illness or infection. A necromancer won't have any of these problems. Even if he lost half his army, as long as he is still victorious, he could simply raise more skeletal soldiers, zombies and whatnot simply by using the fresh supply of dead bodies that suddenly appeared on the field where his army fought a few minutes ago. What a strange coincidence! Or he could simply slaughter some civilians. Not only the men, but the women and the children as well, in order to create more undead for his army. And since the undead are powered by magic, the impact of age and sex should be neglectable. The only thing limiting the size and potency of the army is the skill of the necromancer. And if one can only raise 100 zombies, 100 necromancer could field a considerable army. And even if the army is eventually defeated, every last undead will give the last bit of his unlife to save the magic caster that created them, while inflicting horrendous causalities on the enemy. And all it takes for a new army to spawn is access to some large graveyards or means of killing vast amounts of humans pretty quickly. If we take this into account, and that the undead doesn't need any rest or any form of supply, the most likely reason the Night King needed 7 seasons to reach the wall, while Varys teleported between nations and continents, might indicate that the Night King and his White Walkers needed this time to locate the few remote settlements in the true north. And while it may take a while for you and your necromantic friends to visit some graveyards, you could rebuild the entire army in a month or 2. Meanwhile, your enemy lost half his army in a Pyrrhic victory and still deals with the political and economic aftermath. In Overlord, the loss of more than half of the kingdom's army crippled the already depraved and weak economy, making the food shortage even worse because almost all soldiers were peasants, hastily armed with spears. And by spears we're talking about pointy sticks, without so much as the hint of metal. So necromancers might lose a battle, but eventually they will win the war. And while the core of most undead armies is usually comprised of zombies and skeletons, a potent necromancer may throw in a potent beast here and there, in order to serve as a line breaker. While not undead yet, Robb Stark used his direwolf for this task, while the Night King expanded upon this original concept and got himself a bear, and giants, and a dragon. And of course, fantasy is full of many more epic creatures. For example, the vampire faction in Warhammer is able to field direwolves, giant bats, Vargheist and the Terrorgeist. And if you are a potent caster, you might give your bone boys many boons. The wights raised by the White Walkers can be cut in half by normal weapons, but they can't be killed that way. Only Dragonglass Fire and Valyrian Steel, which might be a combination of the two former, is able to do that. So everything considered, an undead army seems like an unstoppable force. But this kind of army has some rather severe disadvantages, which we will discuss and hopefully exploit in the second part. Over and out.